Hey everyone, ready for some holiday history? We're taking a closer look at Mrs. Claus today.
I think people will be surprised by how far back her story actually
Oh
goes.
yeah, way before the shopping mall Santas we all know and love. I mean, we're going all the way back to the 1800s.
Using all sorts of historical accounts, even some fun pop culture stuff, it's going to be a wild ride.
It really is. Okay, so the first mention we found is from 1849 in a story called A Christmas Legend.
It's not a huge role for Mrs. Claus, though, more of a brief appearance.
Yeah, kind of a blink and you'll miss it kind of thing.
Well, in the story, you have this older couple, and they're disguised.
Oh, I see. And people mistake them for Santa and Mrs. Claus.
Exactly. And that little detail just makes you wonder, right? Was she already a familiar figure even way back then?
That's fascinating.
Uh,
Okay, but then just a few years later, in 1851, we hit a milestone. The Yale Literary Magazine actually uses the name Mrs. Claus.
Written by a Yale student, no less.
And get this, he jokes that even Santa needs a little help getting ready for Christmas Eve. Even Santa needs an assistant,
It definitely suggests that Mrs. Claus is this crucial behind-the-scenes person.
making sure those toys get delivered on time. I like this image of her, not just sweet and passive, but really capable.
Right. Instead of baking cookies, she's making sure the whole operation runs smoothly.
Okay, but this next one, this might be my favorite. In 1854, there's an account of Mrs. Claus dancing at a Christmas party.
With a baby in her arms.
I know, you just don't picture that. I mean, forget the cookies. She's out there having a good time. This image is so different from the quiet Mrs. Claus we often think about.
It really is. It's such an energetic image. Makes you
Yeah.
think maybe she was always more multifaceted than people gave her credit for, capable of being domestic and social.
Absolutely. And I think those early appearances kind of lay the groundwork for how she evolves over time. Because by the 1860s, things begin to shift. We start getting more details about her, and her roles become a bit more defined.
We see a good example of this in Robert St. Clar's 1864 novel, The Metropolites. Mrs. Claus appears in a dream, and she's bringing all these lavish gifts.
Wow, so she's not just baking anymore, she's got some serious gift-giving power. And just a few years later, in an 1878 children's book, guess what? She's the one keeping the naughty and nice list.
That's a big responsibility.
Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, right? This shift from traveler to a more home-based figure. Like, maybe it's reflecting what was happening with women's roles in society at the time.
You could definitely draw that parallel.
And it gets even more detailed. Fast forward to 1887, and Good Housekeeping gives us a full-on Mrs. Claus profile.
They describe her fashion choices.
They even have her giving tips on ideal kitchen design. It's like she's the original lifestyle influencer. Like, here's how to get your kitchen ready for holiday baking.
That's so funny. But it's a bit ironic, right? She's in this domestic role, but she's also being portrayed as this really forward-thinking, knowledgeable woman.
Exactly. She's not afraid to share her opinions. But hold on tight. Things are about to get even more interesting. We come to 1889, and Catherine Lee Bates writes this poem called Goody Santa Claus on a Sleigh Ride.
Now, this poem marks a pretty big shift for Mrs. Claus. And, calling her Goody, which is short for good wife, emphasizes that this is really Mrs. Claus taking center stage.
And in this poem, she's basically saying, I'm done staying home. I'm going on an adventure with Santa.
Exactly. And it's a powerful statement. Mrs. Claus challenging traditional gender roles. This is where things get really exciting. It's pretty amazing how her image kept changing all through the 1900s and even into the 2000s.
She was changing right along with society, especially with how women's roles were changing.
Exactly. And in the last few years, she's really become a star in her own right.
I know, like you see all these events where it's just Mrs. Claus, no Santa in sight. She doesn't need him to be famous anymore.
It really fits with all this focus on, women having their own power and different perspectives being important. And Mrs. Claus doing all these things on her own really shows that.
It really does. Oh, and speaking of new perspectives, we have to talk about Cheryl Lee Ralph. She was the first black woman to be Mrs. Claus in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
That was in 2023, right? What a moment.
It was huge. I mean, what do you think about how important that was?
I think it was so powerful. Representation really does matter, and seeing Mrs. Claus like that, it sends a message. Like, the holidays are for everyone, and there are so many different ways to celebrate them.
It feels like things are changing for the better,
Yes.
doesn't it? So looking at everything we've talked about, from those first little mentions to now, what's the biggest thing you've learned?
I think the most amazing thing is how Mrs. Claus is so much more than just, baking and being nice. She's gone from this mysterious figure to someone with her own voice and her own power.
She's stylish, she's got strong opinions, and she wants to go on adventures. She's not just waiting at home for Santa.
Yeah. And her story is like a mirror to how we've changed our ideas about what women can do, how relationships work, what it means to be a leader. She's part of something bigger than herself.
It's really cool how her story tells us so much about how our own values have changed.
What surprised you the most about her story? Makes you wonder where she goes from here. What's the next chapter for Mrs. Claus?
That's what makes it so exciting. These figures we're talking about, they don't just stay the same. They change as we change.
So it's almost like we're all writing the next part of her story.
I like that idea. Our views, our creativity, even how we celebrate the holidays, it all adds to her story.
That's amazing to think about. Like, she's a symbol of how we want the world to be, more inclusive, more empowered. So out of everything we've learned, what surprised you the most?
You know, it's how she wasn't just this simple character, even way back in the beginning. Like, she had depth, even in those little glimpses we saw.
Like, she had this independent streak, this strength, even a bit of mischief.
Yeah. And she keeps showing that as time goes on. From dancing at that party to wanting to travel with Santa, she doesn't always follow the rules. She really doesn't. It's like she's showing us that you don't have to make a big scene to change things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the small things that make a difference.
You're right. It's that quiet strength that makes her so interesting. She might not be shouting, but she's always there, doing things her own way.
And it reminds us that change doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it's those little acts of courage, the way we think about things differently, that really lead to something big. Kind of like Mrs. Claus herself, working quietly but really affecting the whole story.
That's a great way to put it. I think that's a perfect thought for everyone listening. Mrs. Claus shows us that even those we think we know well can surprise us. And there's always something new to learn. We're all part of making the world what it is, even through stories.
So as you celebrate this year, keep Mrs. Claus in mind. She's a reminder that we can all make things better, that we can question old ways and be open to new ideas, and that the best part of the holidays isn't just the presents or decorations. It's the stories we tell each other and what they mean to us. Happy holidays, and don't stop exploring.